G'day guys, Cam Wild Touring and welcome to this week's episode. This week I want to chat to you guys about shock absorbers. I think in the past on this channel we've gone into quite a lot of depth on GVM upgrades and suspension upgrades and why I required a GVM upgrade on this car to do the touring, the full driving and the towing that I do. I think we've also touched on why I think a lot of you guys in mid-size full drives probably require GVM upgrades as well. Not a lot of payload on modern cars, especially when you start bolting a lot of aftermarket accessories and stuff on. And for the sake of safety and compliance, most of us are going to have to go down the road of a GVM upgrade, but certainly pretty much all of us are going to go down the road of a suspension upgrade. Shock absorbers, the reason I want to chat about them in this video is because there is quite a few variations to how shocks work, what shocks are available. Not really focusing on the brand so much. This is a Pedders one, you know I run Pedders gear, but more about the type of shock. So we've got twin tube shocks, mono tube shocks, we've got remote reservoir, nitrogen charged or nitro gas shocks, we've got foam cell shocks. There's quite a few different variations and that's really what I want to touch on. How shock absorbers work, what's available, and then what's probably best suited to your needs. So we'll get into all that, but let's move into the shed because I'm baking in the sun out here. Oh, I'm having such a hard time with cameras overheating today. I've had to put my Sony in the fridge and I'm now shooting on a GoPro, so hopefully this is okay. Guys, I've got new t-shirts on the web store. This is a brand new design. I'm really happy with this one. It's sort of like a goldy, sort of yellowy goldy sort of color. Came out really good. So they're on the web store right now. If you want to do something to support the channel and help me buy some better camera gear, you can check that out. I just want to go back to basics for a second, if you don't mind, and chat about the two main components of a vehicle suspension system, which are shock absorbers, obviously, and we're going to chat a lot about those in a minute, but also the springs. And the role of the springs in your suspension system is to maintain the ride height of your vehicle and also to support the weight of your vehicle, right? The weight of the car, the weight of the stuff you bolt onto it, your passengers, whatever you're towing, all that kind of stuff. But the other role of a spring that I think we often forget about is to absorb shock. Ironically, these are a shock absorber themselves. As you're driving down a bumpy track, these springs are compressing and decompressing all the time, right? They're moving like this, and that's to absorb the shock of that road. If we just ran springs, we would be bouncing around all over the place and have absolutely no control of the vehicle. So we need these to absorb the shock, but then we need something to dampen that spring oscillation, and that's where hydraulic dampeners or shock absorbers come into it. And the way that they work is they convert the oscillation of that spring into heat. So a piston runs through an oil-filled cylinder inside here, and it heats up the oil that's inside this shock absorber, and that's how that all works. Now this is a twin tube foam cell shock, and that's going to be the most popular type of shock that you guys are going to be looking at. It's definitely the most popular choice for a full drive, and you will hear about monotube shocks, but they're not as popular. They're not as robust, and I'll chat about that in a sec. But first, how a twin tube shock works is, this is just a protective case here for the piston, just to protect the piston. Down here is the outer tube, which is an oil-filled reservoir, and inside here is an inner tube or a pressure tube, which is an oil-filled cylinder that the piston runs through. Now at the bottom of the piston, there's a valve that allows oil to be displaced through the valve. And there's also a valve at the bottom here which allows oil displacement from the inner tube to the outer tube. This one's called the foot valve. Now those valves themselves, I'm glossing over this because the valves allow oil to pass through them, but there is just so much that's involved in that. They're just like little holes and shims and stuff like that. It's just wizardry. A lot goes into that, right? A lot more than I understand. I'm just giving you the basic overview. So this is a twin tube shock absorber. Now, a monotube shock absorber, not so popular on full drives. It's basically just the inside of this. So it's just a oil-filled cylinder and a piston, and that's it. There's no outer tube. So it's a monotube shock. Now, there's a lot of pros for that. There's one really big con. If you sustain any sort of rock damage on that cylinder, that piston's not going to be able to perform its stroke, and then your shock's going to seize and it's just useless. So that's why we run twin tube shocks, because this outer tube can sustain heaps of damage before you're going to have any sort of issues. These get dented by rocks and sticks and all sorts. they get bloody sandblasted by gravel, it's not going to worry them. I've never had one fail from damage to the outer tube. Now, like I said, this is a foam cell shock, and I'll explain how that works in a second. But first I'll chat about what you would have got standard on your car when it was new from the factory, which would have been a gas charge or a nitrogen charge or a nitro shock. Now, all shocks are hydraulic, they're all full of oil. Oil can't be compressed, right? So when the shock is performing its bump stroke, when it's being compressed like that, something has to give. Now, if the oil can't be compressed, there needs to be some sort of compressible media inside here. These use a pressurized nitrogen in the top of the outer tube here. Nitro shocks are cheaper than foam cell shocks, and arguably not as good, I would say. Personally, I'd say they're not as good. And there's two main reasons that I say that. Because this headspace of this outer tube is filled full of nitrogen, when this shock is working really hard, bouncing up and down a corrugated road or whatever, that gas and oil mix, and it causes foaming or cavitation, and you get tiny little bubbles all through your oil. It affects the way that your shock works. It affects its dampening efficiency. And it's often referred to as shock fade, where basically the shock is just not performing as it should. It's not doing the dampening job that it's supposed to do. So that's one reason why I'm not a big fan of gas charged shocks for the kind of full driving and touring that I'm doing. And then the other reason is, I spoke before about how the role of the oil in the shock is to provide dampening as the piston passes through the oil-filled cylinder, but also to absorb the heat, which is the energy converted from the oscillating spring. Now, it needs to be able to get rid of that heat. So this outer tube actually works as like a radiator. So the oil in this outer tube dissipates its heat through contact with this outer tube. And because you've got a large headspace of nitrogen gas in here, you've got less surface area available for this oil to let go of its heat to atmosphere. So if you're doing a lot of corrugated roads, you're probably going to experience some shock fade from the oil and gas mixing, and they're more likely to overheat because they have a lot more trouble dissipating that heat that they're building up. So that's nitro charge or gas charge shocks. And that's probably what came stock on your vehicle. And it is an option when you're looking at suspension upgrade. So have a look at what shock you're actually putting in your car. I always opt for foam cell shocks. Again, it's still a hydraulic shock, and to be able to perform its stroke, like I said, something has to be compressible inside here. Instead of filling this outer tube with nitrogen like they did on that Toyota shock, they have filled this entire outer tube with closed cell foam, so kind of like a yoga mat. And that means that the tiny little air bubbles inside that foam can still be compressed to allow this bump stroke. But it also means that gas can't mix with the oil, so you're not going to get the foaming and the cavitation and the shock fade issues. So that's one major benefit for these foam cell shocks. But the other major benefit is that because there's this thin layer of foam between the inner and outer tube, there is oil on both sides of it, and oil is in contact with this entire tube the whole way up, which means that oil can let go of its heat. It can dissipate its heat a lot more efficiently. So that's always my pick. It's what I run on my 300. It's what I run on my D-Max. The foam cell twin tube shocks, for me, are the best bang for buck. When you look at a aftermarket shock and a factory shock next to each other, you'll notice that the aftermarket shock, this Pedders one, is quite a bit thicker when you're looking at the outer tube. Actually, bear in mind that, these are both rear shocks from my 300 series Land Cruiser. And I must say that Toyota do a fairly big shock anyway. If I was comparing D-Max or Hilux shock absorbers, you'd notice a more extreme difference, but I can make my point here anyway. When you look at these two next to each other, the aftermarket one's quite a bit thicker on the outer tube there. Often you'll hear people refer to like a big bore or a larger bore shock, and they're talking about how much bigger generally the inner tube or the pressure tube and the cylinder are inside, and you're going to notice that the outer tube's thicker because of that. That means more oil volume inside this shock, which is a good thing, and it also means that because that inner tube and the valve on the bottom of that piston is bigger, there's a lot more room for fine tuning. There's more, more holes and more shimming and stuff that can go on that valve, which means that the guys putting these together can have more room for finer control. So a bigger bore shock is, always a good thing. And then you will also see shock absorbers that are adjustable. Sometimes you'll see ones that have a little dial, often on the foot valve down here, that you can adjust the dampening of that foot valve. And that's a good thing. I don't know that the average person needs that. I've had adjustable shocks before, and I got to be honest with you, I played with it at first and then I never really touched it again. If a shock is valved well, and it's suitable for the conditions that you're driving in, then I don't think there's a really big need to have adjustable shocks. But if you're someone who wants to climb underneath your car and play with it, then, you know, by all means, there are shocks that come out with adjustment there. And you'll also sometimes see remote reservoir shocks. They'll often have a braided oil line that goes to a remote oil reservoir, and that means more oil volume, which is a good thing. It probably arguably also means more room for failure, because you've got a few more things that can go wrong. But yeah, so they're the sort of main options for shock absorbers on the market. For me, I think the twin tube foam cell shock is the sweet spot for price and simplicity, robustness and functionality, and that's why I'll always put these on my car. So hopefully you learned something today. I did have to rush that a little bit because I was really worried about this camera overheating again. I've had to cycle a couple of cameras through the fridge today. Let me know in the comments if that was helpful at all. Let me know what you run. Jump on the web store and grab one of these t-shirts if you'd like to. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in next week's video.
Still ain't got what I wanted, man. Same cause, same suffering. I know I reap what I sow.